Cuba is more democratic than the US ever was or is.
Cuba is more democratic than the US ever was or is.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
For more than 60 years, Cubans finally had enough of the communist dictatorship that oppressed them for so long. Yet in America, leftists throughout the political compass not only romanticize Cuba as a progressive paradise, but also simp for the authoritarian government. It boils down to them commending Cuba for their free healthcare and education, while brushing aside the countless human rights abuses committed by the Castro brothers. On the extreme end, socialist dimwits go far as to claim that communist Cuba is freer and more democratic than the United States, deriving from their delusional woke assumptions that America is an authoritarian, phony democracy, while Cuba is a democratic republic in which blacks and the proletariat have equal and direct representation in the government. Many leftists, especially Tankies, deny that Cuba is a dictatorship. In this video, I'll be debunking such communist propaganda that paints Cuba as a democratic nation that respects human rights. One aspect of this claim is the argument that Cuba is a participatory democracy. A prime example of this argument can be derived from a video from communist YouTuber Azure Scapegoat titled "How Democracy Works in Cuba." Keep in mind that his video is out of date since it was made in 2018 before the ratification of Cuba's new constitution in 2019, which, by the way, the Communist Party is still enshrined in the new constitution as a guiding role in Cuban society and socialism as being irreversible. Azure Scapegoat, who I will from now on be referring to him as Azure, centers his argument on poor gotcha points, such as the national voter turnout rate being around 90%, and that Cuba has more percentage of women in the legislature than the US, though that doesn't acknowledge that the Speaker of the House is a woman. It isn't far-fetched to call Cuba an authoritarian regime. Authoritarianism is characterized as a central government that permits extremely limited political freedoms, though the political process and individual liberties are tightly controlled by the state without any constitutional accountability. Spanish political scientist Juan José Linz categorized four major characteristics of authoritarianism. That being, 1. Limited political freedom, with strict government controls imposed on political institutions and groups like legislators, political parties, and interest groups. 2. A controlling regime that justifies itself to the people as a necessary evil, uniquely capable of coping with easily recognizable societal problems such as hunger, poverty, and violent insurgency. 3. Strict government-imposed constraints on social freedom such as suppression of political opposition and anti-regime activity. And 4. The presence of a ruling executive with vague, shifting, and loosely defined powers. All the points about Cuba having a high voting turnout rate or women in the legislature doesn't disprove the notion of Cuba being an authoritarian regime. What really matters is whether the communist government of Cuba fits the four characteristics of authoritarianism laid down by Juan José Linz. Let's start with category 1. Limited political freedom. Remember that under authoritarianism, there are some degrees of political freedoms. However, they are extremely limited to ensure the preservation of the status quo. This is why authoritarian regimes can still have, for instance, women in parliament or national elections and still be, authoritarian. Cuba nevertheless constrains political liberties with imposed controls on political institutions. For instance, despite the implications by Azure of a fair electoral system, Cuba imposes rules that repress the abilities and influence of opposition parties and candidates. Prior to 1992, any political party, with the exception of the Communist Party, was basically banned. However, constitutional changes were made in 1992, which decriminalized all other parties, although with electoral regulations that pretty much ensured that PCC had an advantage in national elections. For instance, political parties are forbidden to conduct campaigns, public speeches, rallies, and nominate candidates, which limits the ability for second parties to be recognized nationally. There are also no presidential elections in Cuba. Instead, the communist government functions like a rigged parliamentary system in which the president and prime minister are chosen by members of the National Assembly. Cuba, however, does hold elections. However, candidates aren't allowed to make electoral promises or pledges, and even then, candidates must meet qualifications such as loyalty to the communist state with no dissenting views against the regime. During national elections, in which delegates run for seats in the National Assembly, candidates can only be nominated by either being approved by government-run agencies such as trade unions and the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, or they must be drawn up by the National Candidature Commission, for which candidates are accounted based on meeting suspected criteria such as patriotism, ethical values, and revolutionary history. Transitioning to the second characteristic of authoritarianism, Cuba, just like any other communist state, justifies its domineering government as a necessary evil with the regime's Marxist ideology. The abolition of property rights and economic liberties are reinforced as necessary for the common good, as well as being needed to achieve the communist utopia for which class and poverty would cease to exist. The suppression of human rights like free speech, free expression, the right to assemble, the right to bear arms, the right to a fair trial are excused as sacrifices for the preservation of the quote-unquote revolution. The Cuban state also exploits anti-American sentiment by formulating a black legend of the United States to justify their authoritarianism as defending Cuba from US imperialism. Castro whitewashes Cuban heroes such as Jose Marti into Marxist icons, even though Marti himself wasn't even a communist and even had made statements condemning socialism. Moving on, there's a lot to say about Cuba in regards to constraints on social and political freedoms. After ousting Cuba's military dictator, Fulgencio Batista, Castro suspended habeas corpus, and this suspension wouldn't be reversed until 2019. Despite the claim by Azure that voting isn't mandatory, according to Cuban Commission for Human Rights, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, or CDR for short, pressures neighborhoods residents to cast ballots by blacklisting those who did not vote. The CDR can be best said to be the Cuban equivalent of the Red Guard, since they are a committee responsible for reporting counter-revolutionary activity and monitoring the people in an Orwellian fashion. Even Fidel characterized the CDR as a quote-unquote system of collective revolutionary vigilance so that everyone will know who everyone else is, what they devote themselves to, who they meet with, and what activities they take part in. Of course, Tankies will counter this by saying that anyone over the age of 16 could join the CDR and that more than 80% of the Cuban population are members. This, however, ignores that top leaders of the CDR are selectively picked by Castro loyalists. Furthermore, in 1991, the Communist parties established the Singular System of Vigilance and Protection, or SUVP, to conduct surveillance on the CDR, along with local police, trade unions, student groups, to monitor for any infiltrators within the CDR and other state-run organizations. In other words, the SUVP is the watchman of the watchmen. There's also the General Directorate of Counterintelligence and the General Directorate of Internal Order, which are basically the KGB of Cuba. The General Directorate of Counterintelligence supervises the activities of the Department of State Security, also known as the Political Police, reportedly dividing its counterintelligence operations into specialized units. One of the units, known as Department 4, reportedly focuses on the ideological sector, which includes religious groups, writers, and artists. The Directorate of Internal Order supervises two police units with internal surveillance responsibilities, the National Revolutionary Police and the Technical Department of Investigation. The National Revolutionary Police are then tasked with spying on activists. Although the Cuban Constitution claims to allow free speech and the press, the Constitution also states that speech and press can only be exercised in accordance to the aims of socialism and cannot be used to attack the Constitution, nor can it be used against communism.
Let me be specific. Your newspapers, radio, television, motion pictures are under state control. No dissent or opposition is allowed in the public media.
Bárbara.
Yes.
Nosotros no tenemos las mismas concepciones.
We do not have your same conceptions.
Nosotros no tenemos el concepto de libertad de
Our
prensa.
concept of freedom of the press is not yours.
Desde luego, se lo digo con toda.
And I say this very
No
honestly.
tengo que ocultar absolutamente
I
nada.
have nothing to hide.
Si nos pregunta que aquí puede aparecer un periódico
If you
contra el
ask us
socialismo,
if a paper could appear here against socialism, I could say honestly, no, it
no
cannot
lo
appear.
permitirá ni el partido,
It will not be allowed by
ni
the
el
party,
gobierno,
the government,
ni el
nor
pueblo.
the people.
En ese sentido,
Okay.
no poseemos
In that sense,
la libertad
we do
de
not
prensa.
have
posee
the
usted.
freedom of the press that you possess in the U.S.
In addition, under Article 77 of Cuba's Penal Code, speech that threatens socialist coexistence or disturb the order of the community is a criminal offense. Article 61 of the Constitution does promise the ability of the people to file complaints and petitions to the authorities, who are then responsible to respond to them. However, this has been violated in the name of preserving the communist dictatorship, most notably in 1998, when the Castro regime was repressing the Varela Project. The Varela Project was a petition drive founded by Oswaldo Bella with the goal to circulate a proposed law that was similar to Glasnost of the former Soviet Union that would establish free speech, freedom of association, free press, religious freedoms, and the release of political prisoners. Despite the project receiving 11,000 signatures, which was more than enough under the Constitution to mandate a parliamentary discussion, in 2003, when the United States was distracted with the Iraq War, the authoritarian government began to crack down against the Varela Project. State police harassed and arrested activists, confiscated signatures, and forced signers to rescind their signatures. State security went as far as to infiltrate the Varela Project by impersonating as canvassing volunteers. Oswaldo even reported that state security agents visited and pressured more than 50 Varela Project signatories to retract their signatures and denounce the Varela Project activists who had collected their signatures. Even today, the Cuban government cracks down against the slightest form of political dissent. For instance, unlike the US, in which Americans can be paid by China to make YouTube content that spews anti-American propaganda without the fear of being hammered by the FBI, Cuba targets social media influencers. In October of last year, Cuban police interrogated 4 political YouTubers, 2 of which were detained, others had their internet cut, and one of them, Ruhama Fernandez, went into hiding after agents stalked and threatened her family, warning that if she continues to make anti-communist content on the internet, that she would quote-unquote disappear. Finally, we reach the 4th characteristic of authoritarianism, which correlates with the head of state of Cuba. After the revolution, the 1940 Cuban Constitution was suspended by Fidel Castro and was replaced with the Fundamental Law of 1959, which wasn't a constitution due to the fact that it wasn't voted into law, but rather by the decree from Castro himself. It consolidated political powers from 3 branches of the former Cuban government into a central authority and removed many of the civil and political rights previously guaranteed to all Cubans. And even then, Castro amended the fundamental law multiple times to acquire more power. For instance, as a way to bypass the 35 age limit for the president, Castro, who at the time was 32 and Prime Minister of Cuba, amended Article 146 to transfer the powers previously held by the president to the Prime Minister. That eventually changed 17 years later with the Cuban Constitution of 1976, which restored the dictatorial powers of the executive branch and appointed Fidel as the new president. Today, with Fidel dead and Raul, at this point, has turned into a 200-pound beef jerky, the powers of the head of state are a bit complicated since Cuba is transitioning into a one-party dictatorship similar to the likes of Communist China and Vietnam. The current president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, is now limited to 2 5-year terms. This, however, doesn't discredit Cuba as an authoritarian regime, as authoritarianism has been defined to include oligarchical rule, whether that be from a party or a military junta. Examples of authoritarian oligarchies include China, Vietnam, the USSR after Stalin, East Germany, and non-communist examples being apartheid South Africa, Singapore, and Imperial Japan. After analyzing every aspect of Cuba, the communist state checks all 4 characteristics of authoritarianism. Regardless of the infinitive evidence that refutes the American leftist myth of Cuban democracy, I have no anticipation that these Marxists will ever concede, since online Tankies are subversive. Communists will continue to call Cuba a democracy by latching to their own definition of democracy that is unrecognizable within the liberal interpretation of the word. Democracy, in the American sense, allows all people, regardless of political beliefs, and opinions to be represented within their government, both state and national. In a communist sense, democracy is a luxury for party elites that works like an echo chamber for the state. In other words, under a socialist democracy, all people are equal, but some people are more equal than others. Despite the wishes of the Communist Party to forever rule the island, Cubans are finally fed up with the failed promises of the revolution after 62 years of communist dictatorship. As of 2021, the Cuban people are demonstrating in the streets, waving American flags and demanding the end of communism that has cursed the country since Castro took over. Yet progressives in the US undermined or downplay the will of the Cuban people by claiming that the counter-protests initiated by the Communist Party outnumber the anti-government protests.
And by the way, Ben omits what? There are now pro-government protests that are just as big as the anti-government ones. But he omits that. So he's going to omit everything that doesn't fit his narrative.
Although the PCC still has a strong following due to 60 years of indoctrination in the school system and isolation, to say that the mass majority of Cubans endorse the communist regime ignores the fact that around 1 million Cubans have fled Cuba to the United States and that 11 million Cubans spend their everyday lives in fear in an Orwellian nightmare. These pro-government, pro-communist protests mentioned by Kyle Kulinski only came to be after the Cuban president ordered his followers to confront protesters.
No vamos a admitir que ningún contrarrevolucionario.
We will not allow any counter-revolutionaries influenced by the United States, allowing themselves to be carried away by all these strategies of ideological subversion to provoke destabilization in our country. There will be a revolutionary response. We call upon all the revolutionaries of the country, all the communists, to take to the streets to any of the places where these provocations are going to take place. Today, from now on, and in the following days.
Leftists, especially Tankies, like to use shady arguments to prove that these anti-government protests are extremely tiny and are exaggerated by Western media to appear like a revolution. For instance, they cite multiple instances in which Fox News or CNN, using video or pictures of pro-communist rallies in Cuba or protests in Miami, and present them as being anti-communist protests in Havana. Not gonna lie here, but yes, there has been instances in which news media deceptively use photos or videos. However, this does not prove that there is a size disparity between pro and anti-communist protesters. Almost all the videos that authentically show opposition protests in Cuba are smartphone footage that has been smuggled into the West through Facebook or other social media sites. And considering that most Cubans can't afford an iPhone, along with the government cutting off the internet in response to these demonstrations, videos or images of anti-communist protests are hard to come by. This is in contrast to the abundance of high-quality footage and pictures taken of counter-protesters coming from the Cuban government or by journalists who were only allowed to film pro-communist demonstrations. Considering the media prefers using high-quality visuals, it is quite obvious that news networks would prefer the professionally taken photos and videos of pro-communist demonstrations over the low-res iPhone footage of anti-government protesters, whether that be because the network can't distinguish between the Cuban protesters and the communist counter-protesters, or they don't give a shit about accuracy and instead use any footage or pictures that look appealing as visual representations. Yes, this is shady, but this doesn't prove that the size of the Cuban opposition has been inflated. Regardless of these facts, Tankies resort to conspiracy theories to latch on to their agenda. And yes, I said conspiracy theories since Marxist-Leninists are conspiracy theorists. And being the conspiracy nutjobs that they are, Tankies have their own spooky organization scapegoat to blame for all the international chaos. Though instead of being reptilians, the Illuminati, or Freemasons, it is the CIA that is initiating the New World Order. Tankies blame the unrest in Cuba on the CIA, claiming that these protesters are somewhat agents or bots trying to jumpstart a color revolution. This conspiracy theory has been propagated by the likes of Second Thought and Hakim. For instance, they claim that the CIA had set up an army of Twitter sock accounts to target random tweets that mention Cuba by replying with the same copy and paste messages.
As soon as news of the protests broke, and I mean immediately, Twitter was flooded with brand new sock puppet accounts tweeting near identical messages. Any tweet that mentioned Cuba would immediately get responses from these fake accounts, all saying more or less the same thing. The Cuban people do not want an end to the blockade. The same blockade which is destroying the Cuban economy, destroying lives and livelihoods, and which has been universally denounced except by the United States and its apartheid state lapdog, Israel. Twitter also suppressed pro-government tweets, but allowed the anti-government bot army to freely violate their terms and conditions.
Yet the mass majority of these quote-unquote CIA Twitter bots are actual accounts run by actual people. What was shown here is just one of those common Twitter trends in which you online spurgs would just copy and paste the same text as a quick and cheesy reply against liberals or conservatives depending on the scenario. We have seen this before late last year when trolls would reply to Trump supporters' tweets with the same quote-unquote, "I love seeing Trump supporters cry, it's my daily medicine" message. Out of the many Twitter accounts screen grabbed by Second Thought, only 2 are literal sock accounts that have already been flagged down. Here are all the screen grabs of all the quote-unquote bots that shows that these accounts are real human beings with business links, Instagram links, and posts of actual selfies. And I want to specifically mention one of these quote-unquote bots, that being Alex Lay, who has been constantly harassed as being a CIA sock account by communist-sipping trolls. Yet a closer look into Alex Lay's Twitter, he is a film director, editor, colorist, and photographer. He has posted images of his face on Twitter, has an Instagram account which is linked in his Twitter bio, and has his very own Venmo where he advertises for his film company. In addition, Alex has defended himself multiple times against communist trolls. Second Thought should apologize to Alex Lay for slandering his Twitter account, for which it ensued a harassment campaign. Second Thought, along with Hakim, speak delusional BS, claiming that the real people of Cuba are those simping for the communist dictatorship, while the quote-unquote small handful of anti-government protesters are all CIA collaborators. Remember that according to Tankies, everyone that is in opposition to communism is a CIA agent. I would love to debunk Castro Sims on the embargo and Cuban healthcare system, but I'll save that for a future video. But before wrapping up this video, I want to respond to Hakim's statement calling out leftists who refuse to join the Castro Simping cult.
To add, though, shame on every single left-punching douchebag that calls himself a leftist that immediately and unquestioningly sided against the Cuban people and their government. You fell for all the simplest tricks, and if you haven't changed your mind, well, just know that every single revolutionary movement you idealize, be it the Zapatistas or Catalonia, had you been present at the time, you would have bent over backwards trying to sabotage and condemn them, either as authoritarian, not pure enough, or whatever other form of brain rot that takes place within the liberal mind. Oh lord.
Although I'm not a leftist, I'll make this response to Hakim in the defense of people who actually care for the Cuban people. Hakim, you don't support Cubans, nor do you care for the country itself. You, just like any other authoritarian bootlicker, pretend to stand for the aspirations of all Cubans, yet disregard the wishes of Cuban refugees who risk their lives to escape the brutal dictatorship that you defend so much. Sure, you can call Cuban Americans traitors for the reason that they turned their backs against the Cuban authoritarian government to live in the US, but you, in the process, will be calling the heroes of Cuban independence traitors as well, since Jose Marti, Galito Garcia, and other Cuban freedom fighters were exiles residing in the United States who had established organizations such as the Cuban Revolutionary Committee of New York to rally up Cuban Americans in supporting Cuba's independence from the Spanish Empire. The men of the real Cuban Revolution, the Revolution of 1898, did not die for the hammer and sickle. They fought with the intent to establish a republican government based on the Enlightenment ideals of the American founding fathers. In Marti's generation, people like Hakim, Second Thought, Bad and Panetta, and Cal Kalinsky would have considered Jose Marti and General Garcia to be quote-unquote gusanos. Jose Marti actually addressed such fools in a letter to Fermin Valdez Dominguez that states, "Socialist ideology, like so many others, has two main dangers. One stems from confused and incomplete readings of foreign texts, and the other form of arrogance and hidden rage of those who, in order to climb up the world, pretend to be frantic defenders of the helpless, so to have shoulders on which to stand." This shocking quote perfectly describes Hakim as if Marti was warning those from the future of subversive communists. Anyway, please like and share this video, leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on Twitter and join my Discord server. Oh, and remember, all commies are bad.